Now, President Trump could be about to amass even more power. The Supreme Court is hearing arguments in a case that will decide whether the president can fire the heads of virtually all independent agencies. This would be a major transfer of power from Congress to the White House. And it's just the latest case testing the limits of presidential power. From tariffs to birthright citizenship, our next guest believes the court is dismantling guardrails that have protected democratic rights for decades. Kate Shaw is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's here now discussing all of this with Michelle Martin.
Professor Kate Shaw, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're a constitutional scholar, you're a law professor. Back in April, you wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times where you opened with, "For weeks, Americans have been debating whether we're facing a constitutional crisis. My answer, for the record, is that we are." And why did you say that?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. I think we have, and have had since January, a president who is pushing the bounds of executive authority in ways we just haven't seen before. And that in and of itself is not, to my mind, enough to constitute a real constitutional crisis. But I think the crisis comes in the failure to meaningfully push back on those outsized assertions of presidential power. And I mean to push back both by Congress and by the Supreme Court. So I think when you have the separation of powers as out of whack as we have had really for the last year, that is a genuine constitutional crisis. And if anything, I think it has gotten more serious since I wrote that op-ed back in April.
So let's fast forward to the present moment, starting with the big case in front of the justices this week, Trump v. Slaughter, which asks whether the president can fire the heads of independent federal agencies at will. Now, that's exactly the kind of question that engages a scholar like you, but that a lot of people kind of just living their lives might be thinking, well, why is that such a big deal? Why is that such a big deal?
Well, so Congress and the president working together have passed laws creating agencies, right? Agencies that often work in invisible ways, but that impact all of our lives. So they do things like regulate the safety of ordinary household products or the cribs that we put our kids in. They issue regulations around things like air that we breathe and water that we drink. They protect consumers, both their privacy and their right not to have companies engage in monopolistic behavior. So there's just an enormous array of work that agencies do. And some of the agencies that do that work, Congress has decided for over a century should kind of operate with a degree of independence from the president and the political winds. And that kind of agency is traditionally known as an independent agency. And agencies, whatever their structure, do respond to the president. The president has lots of ways to influence every agency in the government. But the idea of these independent agencies is the president cannot just fire at will the people who sit at the heads of those agencies. So that includes bodies like the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, a lot of regulatory bodies that there might be good reason to insulate from politics. And for almost 100 years, the Supreme Court has said the president can't just fire at will the heads of those kinds of bodies, including the Federal Trade Commission. And the question of whether the Supreme Court will continue to adhere to that longstanding rule that limits presidential power is the one before the court in the Slaughter case, where the justices are being asked to overrule a 90-year-old precedent that allows those agencies to exist with a degree of independence from the president.
As briefly as you can, just remind us of the facts of this case. How did it come before the court?
This is just a case where the president fired a Democratic commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission and didn't say he was firing her because she'd engaged in any kind of, malfeasance or misconduct, just because he disagreed with the direction that she wanted to take the agency in, which was one that, in her own words, so Slaughter, the commissioner, has basically said the FTC should be aggressively regulating a lot of companies, including companies that are very close to the president. The heads of some of the companies the FTC is currently suing were the ones flanking the president at his inauguration. But that's kind of what independence means. And I think it's pretty clear that President Trump did not want agencies like the FTC to exercise that degree of independence. And so he fired this commissioner. She filed a lawsuit basically saying my firing was unlawful. And that's the question that the court is addressing.
You have written that granting the president at-will removal power would be, quote, a vast transfer of power from Congress to the president, even though, as you put it, the Constitution does not explicitly grant the president any such power. We don't know how the court is going to rule here, but just the commentary from their questions, the precedents that they've set so far, seems to be that they are very, at least the conservative supermajority on the court seems very ready to give the president sort of maximum discretion. Why do you think they're so willing to do that?
And you're right, we don't yet know how the justices will rule, but I would be willing to place a very large wager on the likely outcome in this case based on the tenor of the questions, and that is that President Trump will win and this old precedent will be overruled. But yeah, to your deeper question, why are they so enthusiastic about presidential authority and skeptical of restraints on that authority? I mean, I think that a majority or a supermajority of the court is under the sway of this unitary executive theory, this theory that's really a product of the 1980s and the Reagan administration that says the president has to have complete control over essentially everyone in the executive branch, including the heads of independent agencies, anyone who executes the law, and that means he can fire at will essentially any high-level official in the executive branch. We don't yet know whether that reasoning will extend to, civil servants in the federal government, but it well could. And to my mind, it's a theory that is inconsistent with the text of the Constitution, which doesn't give the president the power to fire anyone. And it's inconsistent with history. There's a lot of kind of cross currents in our history, but I think it's pretty clear that at the very least, the framers disagreed about certain aspects of presidential power. There was no strong consensus the president should be able to fire at will everyone in the executive branch. And I think the better reading of the history is that the framers would have wanted Congress to be able to place some constraints on the president's authority in the way these laws do.
I wonder whether we would be justified in just calling this rank partisanship.
Yeah.
I mean, are we overthinking this? Because could it be that the person who appointed them is in power and they are doing what he wants? I mean, is that wrong? Is that beyond the realm of reason?
No, I mean, that is the Occam's razor sort of simplest and maybe correct explanation is you have a Republican president and 6 Republican appointees on the court likely to further augment his authority. And I think it is telling that in a couple of cases, this same conservative supermajority curtailed the power of President Biden to do things like implement COVID mitigation measures and relieve, significant quantities of student debt. The Supreme Court ruled against Biden in both of those cases, also a major case involving the EPA's effort to regulate greenhouse gas emissions.
Immigration, trying to offer sort of immigration relief, absent some specific direction by the Congress.
Yes, I mean, I think that the justices, I think in their own minds, believe that there is kind of, principle here, that it is about presidential power. But I think that if they do announce these presidential powers, I think the real test will be if, they are willing to adhere to those pronouncements in a future Democratic administration. And I share the concern that it's not clear that they would not find some way to rule differently if we're looking at a Democratic president. And I think it is incredibly corrosive to public faith and confidence in the Supreme Court and its kind of perceived legitimacy for the public to see the court ruling again and again against Democratic presidents, but expansively in favor of this Republican president. Although I should say there may be cases, including the birthright citizenship case, potentially including the tariff case, where it is at least possible that President Trump will lose in front of the Supreme Court.
Well, tell us more about the birthright citizenship case and tell us why you think that's possible. It's possible that the Trump administration might not prevail, as it has in so many other cases
Correct.
Before this court.
Yeah, so this is one of the first acts that President Trump took when he was inaugurated for the second time as president, which was to issue an executive order purporting to end birthright citizenship, the principle that individuals born on U.S. shores are citizens, full stop, regardless of the citizenship status of their parents. This principle traces back very clearly to the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, which conferred citizenship on newly freed, formerly enslaved persons, and also all persons born in the United States, right, on its shores. Congress has passed multiple statutes reaffirming the principle of birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court has confirmed that the text means what it says. And yet, in the face of all of that settled consensus, the Trump administration issued an executive order basically saying we are unilaterally ending birthright citizenship. And I think that what I just said about how clear the consensus across all the branches of government and essentially across 150 years has been that this is a constitutional principle the president cannot undo, I think that all of that will make it very, very difficult for the Supreme Court to uphold this executive order. Every lower court to have looked at the executive order has found it clearly unconstitutional. The Supreme Court encountered a case last spring involving not the constitutionality of this executive order, but essentially the power of courts to issue what are known as nationwide injunctions, so rulings that bind even non-parties to the case. The Supreme Court basically said lower courts don't have that power, but another case that kind of gets around some of the procedural kind of limitations the court announced in that case is now back before the court. It will be argued in the spring, and the court can't avoid answering the substantive question of whether this executive order is lawful. And I just don't see a very significant likelihood that the court will uphold it.
In another opinion piece published in the Times this week, you wrote that the court is, quote, overturning the 20th century. And when you look at across cases about presidential power, voting rights, immigration, agency authority, civil rights remedies, and the court's own procedures, do you think that they see it that way?
I think they believe they are restoring correct legal understandings. I think that in some ways we are still in this kind of backlash court. So the conservative legal movement's birth in the Reagan administration in the 1980s was largely a reaction to the Warren Court from the 1950s and the 1960s, which broadly construed the Constitution's guarantees, the equal protection of the laws, the right to liberty, and the right not to be deprived of liberty without due process of law. These are these core provisions of the 14th Amendment that the Warren Court really expansively interpreted. And I think the conservative legal movement very self-consciously wanted to roll back both some of those specific decisions, but also the method of constitutional interpretation that those decisions reflected. And so I think this is still part of that larger project of kind of fundamentally changing the way we understand the Constitution and a lot of its provisions. And I think that has certainly, we've seen that with respect to voting rights, which the court has really curtailed in the Shelby County case involving Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and likely in the case Louisiana versus Calais, the court will decide likely very soon regarding the last, big remaining pillar of the Voting Rights Act. The court has allowed partisan gerrymandering, which didn't overturn a precedent, but certainly inaugurated an era in which partisan gerrymandering is happening, without any kind of limitation under federal law. Disempowering agencies while empowering the president. I mean, these are fundamental changes to the way we live and the kind of government that we live under. The court has asserted a great deal of power for itself. It has really limited many of the actions that Congress has taken, including things like passing the Voting Rights Act and repassing it with close to unanimous support in Congress, signed into law, authorized and reauthorized by Democratic and Republican presidents alike. And yet the court has unilaterally decided that the Voting Rights Act essentially went too far and is inconsistent with the proper understanding of the Constitution. And so I do think that if you put together the pieces, I think that there is a very strong case. They are fundamentally overhauling much of kind of settled law and governance. And I'm not sure they would totally disagree with that, although I think they have pursued it in, these kind of discrete domains.
Part of your original point here is this is an incredible aggregation of power toward the president, but also away from Congress. So where is Congress in all this? Who is standing up for the institutional imperatives as outlined in the Constitution, the way we all learned it in middle school? Three branches.
A huge part of the problem and the kind of constitutional crisis that we started off talking about is that Congress has been either asleep at the wheel or affirmatively pleased with what it has seen in terms of executive authority in the last year. And I do think it's quite shocking because regardless of the fact that Congress is controlled by the president's co-partisans, right, they're Republican controlled both houses of Congress, the institutional prerogatives of Congress you would think would matter at least to a degree, to the extent that standing up against the president's ability to do things like completely ignore congressional decisions about funding. And yet we have seen essentially none of that. Now, I do think that there has been a little bit of a shift in some of these targeted killings and congressional responses, including responses by some of the members of the president's party, suggesting that perhaps Congress is again finding the will to assert its institutional prerogatives and demand explanations for, processless executions of individuals on the president's say-so, that these are individuals engaged in drug smuggling. Perhaps that is a bridge too far for even a Congress that is largely supportive of this president's policy agenda. And I'm sure the fact that the president's approval ratings are lower than they have been is, emboldening Congress to push back. But I guess my hope is that this Congress be stirring itself to act in the context of these strikes on fishing boats might portend Congress pushing back in other more meaningful ways. I mean, some of the damage, honestly, I don't think can be undone. The president having asserted the power to ignore spending decisions and to unilaterally do things like dismantle agencies Congress by law created, like the Department of Education, like USAID. You can't really reconstruct an agency the president has dismantled, but I don't think it's too late for Congress to take back some of its authority. And it's just critically important that whoever is in control of Congress, that Congress do that in a way we just haven't seen in the last year.
There was some talk earlier that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, was concerned about the reputation of the court being seen as legitimate. Do you think that really is a concern? And if it is a concern, if the court is not seen as a legitimate judicial body, but rather, as some do see it, as the sort of an extension of the partisan interests of the party in power, what then? What difference does it make?
Well, so to the extent that the court, when it is properly functioning, is an important check on overreach by the president and by Congress, right, by other actors, by states and localities as well, it's enormously problematic for the public to lose faith and confidence in the judgments of the Supreme Court, in the independence and impartiality of the Supreme Court, because the court's legitimacy and perceived legitimacy is really the only reason that government actors, private individuals, other branches of government listen to the court, heed its rulings. And sometimes it's really important that the court's rulings be heeded, right? It is obviously handed down in other eras, enormously important decisions, doing things like concluding that segregated public education is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, and that separate but equal is a principle that cannot be reconciled with the equal protection of the laws, right? So to take one example, obviously Brown versus Board of Education, it was critically important that the country accept the court's ruling. There was a lot of resistance. The president, at the time actually used the federal military to enforce the court's edict that school desegregation was mandatory and that Brown versus Board of Education was the law of the land. So it's not impossible to imagine, again, a court that does side with civil rights, equality, liberty. And it's just really important that if and when it does that it have the institutional capital to actually command respect for its judgments against those who would want to resist it. And so I think those are the reasons that getting back to a court that actually serves its function, which is protecting rights and facilitating democracy, and largely otherwise kind of stays out of the way of democracy. That is critically important, I think, to a healthy system of separated powers. But I think what we have right now is something very, very far from that.
Professor Kate Shaw, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next, build, baby, build, as they say. That is the White House Silicon Valley slogan, urging companies to invest in artificial intelligence infrastructure inside the United States. And the campaign has so far been very successful, with tens of billions of dollars funneled into data centers across the country. But while these investments may appease President Trump, they are causing major issues for surrounding communities as well as for the environment. Hannah Beckler, investigative reporter at Business Insider, joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss her findings.
Christian, thanks. Hannah Beckler, thanks so much for joining us. You had a recent investigation in Business Insider titled Exposing the Dark Side of America's Data Center Explosion. What surprised you about this investigation?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I think we have all of these big tech companies who are racing to build out a speculative future built on AI. But the impacts that are happening on our communities, our water, our electricity grids are happening right now. So what we really wanted to investigate is what's happening on the ground, what's going on, and how resource intensive is this build out?
For our audience, unless they're watching this conversation live over the air, so to speak, even the YouTube archive of this is part of what is stored in the data center, right? Kind of give us an understanding, I guess, of what these are and what's different about these versus these AI-focused data centers that are coming in the future versus the ones we're familiar with today?
So the first thing to understand is that a lot of the data centers, they're used for things like social media, our emails, our applications that we're using every day. So all of that doesn't really exist in a cloud. It exists in data centers, which are these kind of big warehouses full of servers that are sort of processing all of that information, all that data all the time. What's different about data centers that are built to process AI is they are even more power intensive. So they require servers that are just many magnifold more power intensive than what we're usually seeing. So we're just seeing a huge escalation in how much electricity these data centers are using.
Okay, and where does that electricity usually come from? If somebody puts one of these data center warehouses into a community, what are they plugging into to get that power?
Well, they're plugging right into the electricity grid, just the same as, our houses and small businesses, that sort of thing. But I think what we're really seeing is that in order to handle the sort of extreme power load, they're often needing to build sort of specialized transmission lines that large scale infrastructure to support that kind of power. And what we're seeing is utilities sort of democratizing those expenses across all the ratepayers. So that means that it's not just the data center, it's, our houses and our small businesses who are paying a little bit more to be able to support that kind of infrastructure.
Okay, and if everybody in the neighborhood, so to speak, is paying for the new transmission line to keep that data center alive and our bills go up, I'm assuming some of these communities are pushing back.
Yeah, we're starting to see some pushback. Places like Georgia and Virginia in particular. Virginia, a filing from Dominion, which is the largest utility company in Virginia, sort of estimated that Virginia ratepayers could be paying as much as 50% more on their electricity bill in order to sort of support broad expansion of the electricity grid in Virginia. So we're starting to see a little pushback. We're starting to see residents say, what's going on here? What does this look like? And regulators are starting to take notice as well.
In response to your investigation, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google told Business Insider that they were committed to paying their full share for upgrades to grid infrastructure like high voltage power lines. Is that the case for the 1,200 data centers that are out there? Because these are just kind of a couple of the companies. Are there companies and municipalities with all kinds of different policies and expectations?
I think those companies really dominate electricity use nationwide. So it's meaningful that they are at least saying that they are committed to paying their full fair share. The problem is that when we look at the actual regulatory filings, we're still seeing a number of data centers. For example, there was one in Georgia recently, a QTS facility, and they're submitting regulatory filings asking for a $300 million transmission line that's being built out there. And that cost will be displaced against all the ratepayers in that area. So it can be really difficult to measure these things and exactly how much data centers are actually paying for the massive infrastructure build out that is required to support their electricity load.
Okay, and give us an idea of how widespread this is. I know in your story, you guys had a map and there were a lot of little dots all over the country.
So I think what was really striking is in around 2010, we were seeing about 311 data centers. That was nationwide. And then by the end of last year, that number had nearly quadrupled to 1,240 data centers. So it's a massive expansion in pretty short amounts of time. And they're mostly concentrated in Virginia, but we're starting to see some other hotspots. So in Maricopa County, for example, in Arizona, or in the central Ohio area.
Okay, when you talk about Arizona, one of the things that automatically, like an alarm bell goes off for me, which is kind of the water table there. And one of the things that you point out is that it's not just electricity that these data centers use, but they also use water. How so?
So in order to keep your servers running, you have to keep them cool. They're running 24/7, so they get really, really hot. They generate a lot of heat. So you need to have something that's going to be, taking away that excess heat. A common system is to use fresh drinking water to be able to sort of run it through the data center and cool off those servers. So some of the very, very largest facilities, they're being built in places like Arizona, where we're already seeing extreme water stress and a lot of drought. And they're competing directly with residents there because they're using fresh drinking water to be able to cool those servers.
And what's the incentive that towns and municipalities around the country have to try to lure the data centers in? I'm assuming that there's a benefit that they're saying, okay, well, we want this data center in our area.
So what we found is 3 dozen states have state level sort of incentives where they're giving sort of 100% sales and use tax abatements to data centers, which is really significant when you're thinking about the amount of investment that is going into building these centers. And then on top of that, municipalities or counties are also offering significant incentives for data centers. So they're saying you can get 100% property tax abatements, for example, for 15 years, which is really striking. What data centers are saying and their operators are saying is this is an opportunity for these areas to sort of transform their economies into high-tech economies where there's lots of high-paying jobs. The reality that what we found is that 80% of data center jobs are in their construction. And once they're actually fully built, you're only seeing, maybe as few as 25 full-time permanent jobs at each facility. So they don't really employ that many workers.
When you looked at this, you had to figure out how much electricity these data centers were going to be using. How did you do that?
Complicated. So many of these operators, they don't really want to disclose how much power their fleet of data centers is using at any one time. So we actually followed our own methodology, which we developed in very close consultation with many academics, engineers, and industry insiders. So we used the air permits. So these are regulatory permits that are issued to the backup generators that each data center has. So data centers can never be without power. So they're always built with these backup diesel generators. And those diesel generators are a point of pollution. So they're regulated by state departments of environment. So we went and requested from all 50 states and DC for those permits issued to data center backup generators. So it's a bit of a couple step process here, but that's how we were able to extrapolate our estimate electricity use. Is we added up the amount of power those generators are able to produce. We applied sort of a redundancy estimate. So you always build more generators than you actually use. And then estimated the amount of what's called capacity, which is how much, power or how much use are those servers running at any one time. So somewhat complicated, but we're able to estimate a range of what these data center we estimate their electricity use is.
And put that in perspective for us. How much power are data centers going to be drawing in the United States if all of these come online?
So by the end of 2024, if all of those permitted data centers are built and constructed and come online, we're estimating that their power use in total could be as much as Ohio, the entire state of Ohio used in 2023 on the low end. And on the high end, it could be as much as Florida used in 2023. So it's a really massive amount of power. A federal estimate actually puts that far higher. So by 2028, they estimate that data centers could be using as much as 600 terawatt hours of electricity each year, which is 12% of what the US uses each year. So it would be a significant amount of power.
There was a study that was estimating that AI-driven data centers could consume 1.7 trillion gallons of water every year by 2027 around the world. In Oregon, there was a local newspaper that found that the Google data centers in the Dalles had used 355 million gallons. They put it in the context of roughly 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it's just, I don't think people understand and the scale of the kinds of water we're talking about or the scale of the kinds of electricity. I mean, when you talk to different researchers, how concerned were they?
Very concerned. So something that we identified is that as many as 43% of data centers, and these are our largest data centers, are constructed in areas where we're already seeing extreme water stress. And what that means is there's not enough available water for the residents that are already there. I think what's also really unique about data centers is unlike other sort of water-intensive industries, data centers are using drinking water. So that means, again, that they are competing directly with residents who need that drinking water to just survive in the desert. For example, some of these data centers that are built in Maricopa County, it's in the desert. So water is a precious and finite resource.
Who owns most of the data centers that are coming out? How did you find that out?
So Sometimes the permits are issued directly to the companies. It's very clear, but in many cases, they are issued to shell LLCs. So we had spent a lot of time looking at other regulatory filings, both at the state and federal level, to sort of match those LLCs to their parent company. Once we did that, it was pretty clear. The most data centers are operated by Amazon. So by the end of 2024, they had 177 data centers by our count. And then we looked at, again, how power intensive these data centers are. And the top 5 probably won't surprise most people. They're the big tech companies that are investing billions of dollars into data center expansion. But it's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and QTS.
Microsoft, they said that they remain committed to developing and supporting innovative solutions to reduce emissions, focusing on long-term solutions. Amazon, which you mentioned, they said they aim to reach net zero carbon emissions across their operations by 2040. Meta said they're committed to fostering the long-term vitality of the communities where they operate. QTS, which is a company that most people haven't heard of, but that owns a lot of these data centers, as you point out, said 100% of QTS centers constructed since 2018 consumed no water for cooling. And then Google, they said they reduced their data center energy emissions by 12% in 2024, despite significant growth in electricity demand. So, you spoke to a lot of different people that were kind of living in the neighborhoods where these data centers are coming now or they're planning to come. What were the concerns that they had as, I guess, neighbors?
So what you have to imagine is these facilities are, first of all, they're enormous. Many of them are very, very large. They operate 24/7. So what that means is that they have these large industrial cooling fans that are operating constantly. And those fans are loud. They emit sort of a loud, sort of buzzing, droning noise that's so loud that when we spoke to some residents who their houses are built, just a couple hundred feet away, that constant noise, it's shaking their windows. One resident told us that he had to move his family into the basement in order to try to escape the noise to be able to sleep. So it's sort of an omnipresent fixture of their lives now.
In response to one of the people that you were talking to in your story, Amazon said that we saw a meaningful reduction in the noise from the improvements, basically mufflers on fans, taller exhaust vents, and they now are operating well below ordinance. Considering that we are heading into a future that seems to include artificial intelligence, why should, I guess, general Americans be concerned about this kind of abstract notion that we're talking about, these larger infrastructure costs? Because most of us are just getting used to, oh, hey, look, I can just do this great little search on my phone and it works. So I don't have a data center next to me. Why should I care?
I think what we're seeing is a dramatic expansion in data centers that are already having a dramatic impact on our grids, our electricity, our environment, the clean air that we, enjoy, and the clean drinking water near our communities. So, many of these companies, again, are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars that may amount to as much as $1 trillion in capital expenditures in the next couple of years alone. So the kind of build out that we're seeing is on a scale that we frankly have never really seen before in this country. Some people have really equated it to something like the Industrial Revolution or how the railroads were expanded across the US. So we're seeing a huge amount of investment in something that, again, remains to be seen if it's actually going to pay off. It's incredibly speculative, but big tech companies are betting big on that speculative future built on AI. Again, the impacts, though, are happening right now. We're seeing how utilities are moving away from planned green energy, such as solar and wind power, to keep more sort of coal-fired plants or natural gas-fired plants running. So that's, again, it's going to have, a really outsized impact on climate change, for example. And it's also having an impact, again, on our water, where we live, our communities nationwide, as these continue to be expanded across the country.
So what is the role of government to try to regulate this? I mean, maybe give us some perspective from one administration to the next, or as these projects keep rolling out, is there regulation somewhere that we should look at as a model? Is there regulation that's failing somewhere that we should try to avoid?
Well, It's been interesting to look at it historically. So when you're looking at 2017, for example, some of these very giant data centers are going into Ohio. Ohio regulators are allowing the utility, for example, to give them what they call economic development rates. So meaning that a company like Meta might actually pay a cheaper electricity rate in order to kind of build their data center. So you go from that perspective in 2017 to as recently as this year, we're seeing regulators actually think, we need to add additional riders onto these data centers to make sure that they're paying their fair share for those transmission costs, that we're not displacing the electricity cost onto residents and small businesses in the nearby areas, that data centers are paying their fair share for electricity costs. So we are starting to see some regulatory efforts taking shape in Ohio and Virginia and Georgia. So kind of remains to be seen if those same regulations are adopted nationwide.
Is this just the cost of doing business in a future with AI?
Great question. I think the problem is that none of us really know. So much of this, again, is speculative. We're not seeing the payout that we'd expect to see in economies or how it's transforming sort of our work life in the same way that some of these big tech companies are promising. What we are seeing, though, is a dramatic change in how our electricity is produced, how the impact on the environment is, our electricity costs, the amount of clean water we have. So I think we just have to really think, maybe this is the cost of doing business if we want this future built on AI, but is that cost too high?
Investigative reporter with Business Insider, Hannah Beckler, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Starvation still grips Gaza under Israel's siege, where the UN warns a famine is unfolding before our eyes. We take a moment to consider the heritage under threat. Traditional Palestinian food has long been a source of identity and memory for the diaspora. Sami Tamimi is an award-winning chef who was raised in the old city of Jerusalem and uses cooking to tell the story of Palestine. He joins Michelle Martin to discuss his new cookbook, Bustani, and the cultural resilience of his homeland.
Thanks, Biana. Sami Tamimi, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Your new book is Bustani. What does it mean?
In Arabic, it means my garden. It's related to the whole narrative of the book where, I talk about my grandfather's garden in Hebron, where we used to spend quite a lot of time there, especially in the summer. And I talk about it because it connects to a lot of things. I always kind of reminisce on food and memories, and this is what really kind of connects me to Palestine, my family, the heritage, the food as well. It's very, very kind of strong element in our kind of culture, but also the family. And my father just loved his little bustan, or the little garden, piece of land that he had, and he grew so many things, vegetables and fruit, and you name it.
Is that why the book focuses on vegetables?
It does in a way, but also I think I started cooking some of the dishes at lockdown when COVID was on, and I was in Italy. We have a little place in Italy, and the climate is very similar to Palestine. So just to go back to connect, I was homesick. I wanted to be with the family, my siblings, and eat with them and just kind of feel a little bit more connected. So I started going out and foraging for things.
You have such strong memories of flavor and smells, even now. Do you think, is this because you're a chef, or is this because you're a human?
Both, but I think also, I grew up in a food obsessed kind of surrounding, I remember vividly sitting down to have breakfast, and they already talk about lunch and dinner and what's in the season, what they're gonna cook tomorrow, which auntie is coming, so what dish are they gonna do? So it all kind of stays with me. But also I remember it's also, anybody who kind of immigrates to a different country and different culture, to stay connected, you tend to kind of dwell on the flavors that you kind of grew up on. And as a chef, of course, I borrowed from my mom's kitchen and the Palestinian kitchen all of my career, and the last 20 years been cooking a lot of Palestinian, which also, I mean, I find it really important that I want to do that to promote the Palestinian culture and the food, but also because it's the kitchen that I understand 100%. And I feel total kind of comfort and comfortable with it.
You became famous as part of the team at Ottolenghi in London, which is something that, it's a kind of its own story as a cultural touchstone, as a place of amazing food. I was thinking about African American food, or the food that we call like soul food, in America. A lot of us grew up eating it and we thought of it as home food. We didn't think of it as restaurant food. We didn't think of it as cuisine. And I wondered, when you were cooking in, these restaurants, you were a head chef, you're in, major cities around the world, doing your thing. I wondered, did you think of Palestinian food in that way? It's like, this is for home, whereas this is for work, as different from work.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a lot of dishes that you only eat at home because although they are made with love, but they take a lot of time and care, and sometimes they are not suitable for a restaurant serving. And I kind of, from an early kind of age, I was really loyal to the traditional Palestinian. I wanted to eat it, and I wanted to cook it at home, but I didn't want to serve it in a restaurant because I wanted to do a mixture of something else, to use all the elements, being loyal to the dishes, but not ruin them. I would just add in kind of different layers and textures and flavoring to present it in a kind of restaurant kind of way. We didn't do that so much at Ottolenghi. It's more the cookbooks that kind of started like that.
It just seemed like for years, some of these dishes are familiar, but it's sort of been served under the rubric of Mediterranean, right? Yeah, like big part of the world, big region, yeah. Middle Eastern. And I wonder, do you think that people are starting to see Palestinian food as part of the culture of these people in this place?
Yeah, and thanks to a lot of chefs and authors and people like me who have been writing about it, and also because people no longer want to just kind of, when you present them with a cookbook that kind of Middle Eastern, it's like, where in the Middle East? It's a huge part of the world, or Mediterranean run from Europe to the Middle East to the Gulf. It's kind of, half of the world you can kind of put under the umbrella of Mediterranean. And I personally don't like this kind of these kind of cookbooks because they don't offer you anything that kind of original in a way. They don't focus on one place, but also people really want to kind of focus on where it is from, and also the history of it, the background, the tradition. People ask me to the day what kind of tahini I use, or what the kind of sumac. Can you give us a brand, where it comes from? It's really, really important for people. And also Palestinian, because of what's happening now for so many years, never had the credit for people been borrowing Palestinian dishes, putting them out there, and not giving them their credit. But also, as a Palestinian, I think people were in such a shock of what happened, that food was kind of part of their preservation, but they didn't think that they needed to protect it and put it out there. And I see that in writing. I mean, this is what I write about Palestinian cooking at the moment, because I see it as documenting, first of all, but also showing that these dishes didn't just kind of happen. They have their own history, their stories, they're waving with the whole culture, the connection to the land, to the farming, to the surrounding, which, really, really important in the whole kind of...
But of course, the whole question of his history, story, culture, narrative.
Yeah.
what is true and what belongs to whom is so very fraught in this part of the world. It's so very challenging, and so very emotional. And I remember, honestly, I'll tell you, I remember we talked about your previous cookbook, Palestine, and I remember getting this angry email from somebody who said, because we were talking about Palestine and Palestinian cookery, that I was negating the existence of Israel. And I was like, can you even talk about history and talk about a place without wading into the politics of it?
I mean, you can't. Everything that you touch in the region turned into politics, but you can't also not talk about it because they are facts. It's not something that I make up and just write in a book, and it's not my narrative as well. And also, I don't talk for the Palestinian. I am one Palestinian man that see the narrative as it is. I don't make my own narrative to sell a cookbook. They are facts. It's history. It's been written. I just go back and search for it, and I have the authority to write a cookbook and write what's the background, the history, and you don't have to try hard to dig into the facts.
Well, I would also say, though, that this book is very personal. It's infused with your memories.
Yes.
Your memories of experiences, your memories of relationships, your memories of flavors, your memories of how it made you feel. And it reminded me of so many people that I know who live apart from the place of their birth and also the place of their memory, and how the food brings them back to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When you say Palestine or Palestinian, you get bombarded by lots of kind of negative. And I want to show how people live in modern time Palestine, and talking to all these really inspiring people. They're all kind of related to food and the way they live their life. And it's really, really inspiring because, I mean, I remember a couple of them saying, we don't want to sit and cry about what happened. We want to kind of help ourselves, the family, our community, our country. And this kind of really, really kind of important to show to people, because through cookbooks and through, we are connected really strongly. We all understand that the language of cooking and eating and sharing food and celebrating that. And through Palestine and now Bustani, I wanted to show another side of the Palestinian, which is not just people being starved and being killed and bombarded. And it's kind of, there's quite a lot of my own memories, but also they are related to people that I know. They are related to my family, me growing up in Palestine. And this is something that over generation, now that they come, it's going to get lost. And it's important to write them for next generations.
Okay, so now let's talk about some of the recipes. So, well, let us talk about some of your favorites, if I can put you on the spot. And I also want to know which ones that I can easily make without having to be a trained chef.
You can do the couscous fritters. I already published a similar recipe, not really similar, but based on the same dish that my mom used to make for us as kids. And it's total comfort. It's just warm couscous with tomato and onion. And it brings so much joy and comfort. And I wanted to bring them back because I think people really want you to try them. They're really beautifully, it bring you also comfort, but also wanted to bring them back in a different way. So I decided to add peppers into them and a lot more heat, and shape them in a kind of patties and serve them with a really punchy preserved lemon, dill, and capers yogurt. And they are a hit. And people really love them, but also kids love them.
What about the soups? I mean, I noticed that you said that whenever you're feeling sad or feeling a little unsettled, that you want a soup. I am the same way. What about a soup?
I prefer not super hot, like a temperature hot soup, but frike soup, for example, with vegetables, which is a very, very simple soup. always it's very soothing and
Okay, freekeh and vegetable soup. Now,
Yeah.
can we get all these ingredients here? I mean, you were saying you were foraging. I don't particularly think I'm going to go foraging in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I got to be really honest.
You don't need to forage. I like to talk about it because I think it's important. When people really disconnected from seasonal ingredients and also from what grows around. But I'm not asking people to go out and forage if they can. That would be amazing. But the book doesn't use any kind of unusual or things that you can't really get in the shops. And most of these ingredients are kind of available now wherever you are, and also online.
It's an unsettled time. I mean, it's a very difficult doesn't even capture it. I mean, the words I'm using are just not adequate to describe the suffering that many people are experiencing.
I am sad. I am very sad about what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. But I am a hopeful person. I am positive, and I let my work talk for itself. I am eager to. I'm almost like on a mission now to promote as much of the Palestinian food and culture, and this keeps me sane and keeps me thriving and going forward.
You said you wrote, once again, I wanted to focus on Palestinian food, not just because of where I come from. I believe that Palestinian food, tradition, and culture have a lot to offer the world. They are a great testimony to resilience and a way of preserving food culture by passing it down through generations. You write, the responsibility of writing these recipes and stories has weighed heavily on my shoulders. And you say, I hope and wish that many of you try the recipes, read the stories, and want to know more about Palestine, the place, its people, its culture, and its food, this wonderful place I call home. Is there a time when you think you'll be able to go home and feel at home?
Not as it is now. For me, going back, I mean, I get it. I don't want to kind of turn it into this kind of political thing, but for me, going back home, it means that I'm treated like a second-class citizen. I am the known person in my own country, and I still get treated badly. I couldn't be as successful if I stayed back home, which is really sad to think about it in a way.
It is, but the book itself is not sad. You talked about the responsibility weighing heavily on you.
Of course.
But like you said, you also don't want to overshadow the pride and the joy. And so how do you want us to think about it now that you've gifted us with this? What would you like us as readers and as cooks to draw from this work?
To cook the food. To really kind of, this connects you also to the whole narrative of the book, but also to the place and to the people. To cook the food and also read the stories and wanting to know more, and hopefully people want to kind of read a lot more about what happened. And it's not just black and white like we see it nowadays. It's more. There's a lot more to it than it is. But also, cooking and writing about food, it's a good tool for people to dive deeper into a culture, into people, and also to try to understand what happened. I'm hoping, just for people to cook from it. And, it is deliberately lighter weight than Palestine because I wanted to, because it's me and because I'm talking about myself and my memories, there's quite a lot of positive in it. And it's something that really important for people to kind of also read it and see it. I cook when I'm happy, and I cook better when I'm happy.
Sami Tamimi, thank you so much for speaking with us once again.
Thank you very much.
We turn now to academia in the United States, where elite colleges are standing up to pressure from the White House, some of them anyway. It comes as President Trump suggests he may stop giving grants to Harvard University as they resist his administration's escalating demands. But what are the implications of their pushback? In an exclusive for the Wall Street Journal, Douglas Belkin discusses exactly that, and he joins Hari Srinivasan to explain more.
Christian, thanks. Doug Belkin, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece in the Journal this week. It was titled Elite Universities Form Private Collective to Resist Trump Administration. I guess the basics, who, what, where, when, why. I mean, who are the universities? How many are there?
There's about 10 universities. Most of them are private schools in blue states that have been tapped by the Trump administration's task force to combat anti-Semitism or fear that they're going to be communicated with and investigated shortly.
So what is their goal in this private network?
Their hope is to coordinate responses so that they don't kind of get picked off the way the law firms did. There's a couple of things that they're very protective of, and their hope is to be able to maintain integrity along those specific points so that they don't negotiate them away one at a time.
Well, did they learn anything, or is this a response to what happened at Columbia?
It is. I think Columbia, as far as a lot of the schools are concerned, is a blueprint for how not to handle the situation, in that a lot of schools feel like they have compromised themselves by negotiating with the task force. It should be noted they're under tremendous pressure at Columbia, internally and externally, and because they had such significant protests there. So they're in kind of a different category in some ways.
So why do you think there's such a different direction that Columbia took from what Harvard is doing now?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, they were first. Second of all, ground zero for the protests and the encampments were Columbia. And the internal conflicts, internal politics with faculty, between faculty and trustees, is probably more intense there than anywhere. So they have a number of issues to deal with. There's also a significant number of folks, faculty and trustees and administrators, who believe that the school needs a course correction, and that the Trump administration is offering things or suggesting that they move in a direction that they wanted to go in anyway.
When it comes to the type of control that the Trump administration wants to exercise and what might be happening at Columbia or what might be agreed to, what is the thing that the universities that are in this new sort of consortium are really most afraid of?
They're concerned of giving away their independence, their academic independence. What they don't want is for the Trump administration or anyone else to dictate who they hire, who they admit, what they research, how they teach. These are the red lines that they're sort of congealing around.
This week, Harvard released a report following their internal probe into how the university dealt with anti-Semitism. What did they find?
Well, it was a really expansive report. And sort of the headline finding is that they found there was a lot of both anti-Semitism and the culture that produced it. So they took the long view. They looked at the Jewish community at Harvard over time. They looked at the boycott, divest, and sanction movement over the past 20 years and how that's influenced the campus. They looked at the curriculum of some schools, the divinity school, the public health school, and some of the classes there they found to be sort of offering the point of view of the Palestinians and not the Israelis, not the Zionists. And so they found that there was some level of indoctrination in some of the classes.
Has there been a response from the Trump administration to Harvard's report?
They essentially are saying that Harvard needs to hold itself to higher standards. They need to do better. They need to protect Jewish students. And if they're going to be the recipient of billions of dollars in federal funds, they need to make sure that all students are treated with respect and don't have to feel harassed on campus.
When you look at these institutions, they have the advantage in that they have massive endowments, that they're certainly going to lose significant sums of money if the Trump administration does what it says it's going to do and withdraw some of the grant funding, et cetera. But they have the ability to absorb this shock way better than certainly public universities, smaller colleges, right?
I mean, they have a $53 billion endowment. So if anybody can endure what the Trump administration is threatening and moving on, it's Harvard University. What Harvard would say is that their endowment is essentially spoken for, not all of it, but a huge chunks of it. When you give money to the university, you say, I'm endowing a chair, I'm endowing a sports program. and that money is legally bound in that direction. They do, however, have billions of dollars at their discretion that they use for the operating budget. So they have more latitude than almost any other university in the country.
Now, what are some of the points of leverage the Trump administration still has left? I mean, I've heard that the tax-exempt status, for example, that universities and nonprofit colleges enjoy, that's one thing that they're looking at.
There's a number of things. They've asked for reports from something called 117s when a university gets $250,000 or more from overseas. They need to file paperwork. Essentially, the Trump administration said they didn't do that. They haven't done it correctly. As a result, they're sort of out of step with the paperwork that the federal government demands when they get any kind of research grant. And so that puts those grants at risk. They also have the ability potentially to turn off the valve for international students from coming on campus, and potentially faculty. So, there's upwards of 10,000 people at Harvard who come in from other countries. They provide a lot of money, but even more importantly, these are brilliant people who are coming from around the world to study and to do research. So it really cuts Harvard off at the knees if they were to shut that off.
So what are the ripple effects here? I mean, not that they have been able to do those things at Harvard yet, but really even the threat of the potential that those things can happen. Does that have a chilling effect on researchers who are thinking about taking a job at Harvard or another university that might be in the crosshairs?
Yeah, this affects the university at every level. From what you just mentioned, research is taking it on the chin right now in a couple of ways. There are major grants that are, in some cases, global, or certainly link schools around the country that have just been shut off or are threatened to be closed. So careers are at stake in terms of the researchers and how they'll continue to move forward if that money doesn't happen. Some of them will try eventually to move to different universities, potentially in different countries. One of the more longstanding potential impacts could be that graduate students, these research fund, these grants fund research, and that money is used to hire PhDs, postgrads who do a lot of the work in the laboratories. If they don't have the money to pay for them, then they can't enter into the research, potentially squelching their careers in the United States before they really get started.
I saw Ursula von der Leyen in the EU essentially inviting scientists to come over to European universities and countries. Is it too early to see any kind of active poaching going on?
The attempts are happening. We're beginning to see things like this around the country. There's a couple of professors who have suggested they're going. I think a couple who have. It's not such a small thing to pull up a research laboratory. Just think for a second, the process of getting a grant that would fund a research lab doesn't take a week or a month or a year. It takes years. It's a tremendous investment in time and brain power to get these things. It'd be much more efficacious for the universities and the researchers if this thing gets negotiated to some kind of compromise.
You kind of point out in this article, too, that this issue of the White House versus Harvard, it might be coming to a head now, but it's a long time in the making. Explain.
Yeah, the reason this is such a interesting issue and such a politically powerful issue for Trump is because the universities lost public support over the past 15 years. Faith in higher education plummeted by something like 25 points, according to Gallup, between like 2015 and 2023. A lot of things, because these universities have lost the public, there's anger toward them, there's frustration. Folks feel like, there's a contract that universities, an implicit contract that universities have with the public in exchange for significant funding and freedom. They need to graduate students who are both prepared for the labor market and prepared to be good citizens. And there's a large swath of this country believes that they failed on both those counts, and they're angry about it, and they want to see them punished.
Is there a next move here between where this group of universities want to get to, whether they think that they have any kind of negotiating power or leverage or ability to talk to the administration?
So first of all, there's a court case happening right now. Harvard sued the Trump administration, and that's being heard in federal court in Boston. that's going to play out over time. The negotiations are happening between universities. These universities are major employers. So Congress people, senators, governors, business leaders are all invested in some kind of settlement, some kind of way forward. The entire economy of Massachusetts, to some extent, is contingent on the success of Harvard. You can multiply that by pretty much every major research institution in the country, in every city, in every state, rather. So the stakes are enormous. The stakes for the American economy are tremendous. The research that comes out of these universities is the foundation for a lot of the businesses that power our economy and keep the country, the hegemon that we are. So there's a lot playing.
Is there a sense at these universities that this is a blip, this is something they can weather, they can negotiate through, or that this is kind of a watershed moment, that there's going to be a before and an after where they will have to structurally and tactically think differently?
I don't know anybody who doesn't think that this is not a watershed moment. There has been some pushback from the federal government with regards to issues around Title IX, but it just didn't go to this extreme. The relationship between universities, research universities, and the government has been so tight for so many generations that the shot that Trump is calling now is from a playbook that had not been written before.
When you think about kind of what American academia brings, not just to college students, but really when you think about innovation and the economy and future jobs, right? Whether somebody decides to come up with an idea in a research lab here versus in Europe somewhere, what the effects of that are. I mean, is there anybody that's trying to quantify the kind of value that universities operating the way that they do today are bringing to the U.S. economy? And if this structural change happens, what the consequences might be?
There's a couple of hard numbers in this equation. Universities are maybe the 8th largest export business in the country. It's a funny way to think about it, but there's about 1.1 million students from overseas who study at American universities, and they bring their dollars into this country, about $48 billion. I think we get about 120 billion for fuel and gas. It's a huge export industry. So that alone is enough to put a significant dent in the economies of these universities. Adding on that, the research, if you look at your iPhone, there's hundreds of patents that were developed at universities. It's quietly done. Everyone knows what Steve Jobs did. He assembled the collective brain power of the inventions and the insights generated at these universities across the country. So you could make a pretty strong case that there wouldn't be the iPhone that we're holding, the internet that we're speaking on, unless these universities had done the research that is now being threatened.
Are the presidents and the boards concerned about brand damage and how future classes of applicants or students or professors or research assistants are going to measure them in what seems like a politically unwinnable situation?
Trump isn't, there's a reason that this task force exists with regard to anti-Semitism on campus. And the report yesterday found significant anti-Semitism. They found, and Islamophobia. They released 2 reports. Behind that was a decline in standards of curriculum and teaching, which is very damaging to Harvard's brand. This is the greatest institution of the Western civilization, if you ask folks at Harvard Yard. And so if they're compromised on the integrity of their teaching, then their brand is absolutely tarnished as a result. So that's half the equation.
What's the other half?
If the universities are seen by folks on the left as compromising too easily or quickly, then they will consider universities to be sellouts. They'll say, you have this tremendous wealth. and privilege and power. And if you're not willing to leverage it, to stick your necks out collectively against what a lot of folks would consider to be a sort of creeping fascism, then they'll look like cowards, and that will damage the brand from the other direction.
Doug Belkin, reporter from the Wall Street Journal. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much for inviting me on.
Now, earlier in the program, we discussed the acts that Elon Musk has been taking to critical agencies in a way that many believe could be unconstitutional and even illegal. In a new piece for The Atlantic, journalist Jonathan Chait warns that it is urgent for the legislature to reclaim its power before it's too late. And he tells Michelle Martin why too late could come a lot sooner than everyone thinks.
Thanks, Christian. Jonathan Chait, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
I want to talk about a couple of recent articles that you've written for The Atlantic, but I want to start with one where you say that the constitutional crisis is here. In plain language, what are the things that lead you to that conclusion?
Well, the Constitution's Article 1 gives Congress power over spending, and that's the system that we've had in this country for the entire existence of this republic. If Congress establishes an agency or a spending program, that is the law, and the president has to follow the law. Now, there have been disagreements about how the president handles that and the priorities, but that basic fact has not been challenged. And that fact is what the Trump administration is now challenging. They are claiming for themselves the right to eliminate any program or any agency that they don't like for any reason whatsoever. So that is totally new, and that would completely upend the balance of power between the branches of government.
Do you think that the public sees it as seriously as you do?
No, I don't, although you are seeing some evidence that President Trump's approval ratings are falling back a bit even just over the past couple of weeks. And you've seen that Elon Musk has grown unpopular. So I think the general idea that the administration is doing something radical and moving really fast is getting through to the public. And it's common for presidents to come in and think the public wants them to undertake radical change. This is a mistake that presidents of both parties have made, and assume that the public will reward them for moving things really fast. And that's usually not the case. And this seems to be another instance in which that same mistake is being made.
So what are some of the moves that the president, with Elon Musk in the lead, this tech mogul, richest man in the world, what are some of the decisions that they've taken that have caused this kind of alarm? Describe what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, they put out this very broad and confusing memo that seemed to just suspend the entire federal government's operations, in which threw lots of people justifiably into a panic before a court sort of slapped them down. But now they're trying to do a version of that seemingly piecemeal. You've got Musk holed up in the Eisenhower building next to the White House, just kind of going through the federal budget and without having much expertise to do this job, determining which programs he considers wasteful or fraudulent or part of some kind of left-wing conspiracy that he imagines has been going on for years, and in trying to just zero out those programs or declare them dead. And then meanwhile, they're sending out letters to the whole federal workforce, urging them to retire immediately. And some people are figuring out whether they should take that offer or whether it is an offer at all or whether it's even legal. And all these things are very hard to determine. So they're just throwing sand into the gears of the machine, or they're just jamming up the machine as hard and fast as they can without having a very close idea of how it operates and what the effects of all this might be on the people who are relying on these government services.
One of the things that has really set off red flags for a lot of people is that Musk and this group of young software engineers, apparently, some of them, we're told that one of them is as young as 19 years old, most of them are in their early 20s, have had access to the Treasury's system for dispersing government funds.
Right.
And this has heretofore been supervised by career employees. The career employee who was in charge of this was retired under duress, it seems, after he objected to them having access to this. Now, as we are speaking now, a federal judge has said they can only have limited access. Only two members of this team can have limited access. It's so-called read-only access. Would you just talk about why this is so concerning?
think anybody knows exactly what they're doing. And that's part of the reason for the concern. We do know, though, that they've misled the public about this. They said that Musk only had read-only access to this information. But reporters found that they didn't. They actually had access to go in and change the outcomes of these payments. So what people think, although, I don't want to just pass on speculation as fact, but it seems as if Musk is inclined to use this tool to advance this anti-government agenda that he's set out for himself. That basically, instead of going to Congress and saying, we think this program is too big or this agency should be shuttered, they're just going to unilaterally cut off the payments to whatever programs that they think shouldn't exist, just going straight to the end point. And so that would accomplish his work immediately. And even if the courts were to step in and say, you can't do this, the damage of moves like this would be so difficult to reverse that they might functionally succeed in their goal, even if it's illegal.
President Trump and his kind of designated agent in this, Elon Musk, have been arguing that these programs are either inefficient or, in their words, corrupt. What do you say to that?
Look, there are inefficient programs in the federal government, and there are certainly inefficient systems that prevent the government from functioning efficiently. And I know of some policy wonks who've been writing about this and trying to make the government work better. It's very frustrating that they're not listening to people like that who have real expertise and actually want to make the government more cost effective and more efficient, and instead seem to be just running rampant through the government, picking out programs that have names that sound weird to them, or which they just make seat of the pants guesses are doing something bad or something progressive, and just zero them out with any real thought. So it's frustrating as someone who wants to make government more efficient that they're not doing this in any kind of careful or respectable way.
Before we move on to the constitutional crisis aspect, because that is your larger point, that this isn't just about an overreach in one area by a person who is inexperienced, doesn't really know how the government works, what it does, is that he seems particularly fixated on USAID, which distributes humanitarian aid. The president and Elon Musk seem particularly fixated on this, to the point of using some very disparaging language to talk about the people who do this work and the work that they're doing. Why are they so fixated on these agencies? Do you have this particular agency, do you have any sense of that?
That's a great question, and I've tried to figure it out. It's one irony, and I'm actually working on a story about this, is that the Marxist left hates USAID, has always hated USAID. And the reason they hate it is that it is a tool of American foreign policy. And as such, it was designed to counter the effects of communism, now counters the effects of the Chinese Communist Party globally. By providing humanitarian aid throughout the unaligned world, it tries to show the world that the United States cares about them. So it's a kind of joint diplomatic humanitarian mission. So describing it as Marxist is really an inversion of the truth. Now, why they came to this, as you say, is very, very hard to understand. If you wanted to give them credit for being clever, you'd say the American public doesn't like foreign aid. The American public massively overestimates the amount of the budget that goes to foreign aid. So one reason people don't like foreign aid is because they think we're spending far more on it than we are. But it is a soft target. And if they want to establish the principle that the White House has the right to terminate any federal program that it wants without going through Congress, you want to start with the softest target to begin with, and then you've established the principle, and you can start going after harder targets. And that would really enable conservatives to advance policy goals that they've always wanted to do, right? You've got large chunks of the conservative movement that have opposed the expansions of government that have taken place since the New Deal and the Great Society, but considered a lot of these large spending programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security to be popular and difficult to cut or to privatize. But if they could just do it at the White House with the snap of the fingers and not have to have a vote in Congress, not to have public accountability, that would be a generational change in the structure of government and advance a lot of their goals.
One of the arguments that you make in your piece is that, look, if this is a constitutional crisis, this speaks to a neutering of the third branch of of government, which is the Congress, then presumably everybody in Congress should be concerned.
Or the first branch of government, I think, is the founders designed it to be the first branch. Congress is supposed to be preeminent.
The first branch. But the question I would have for you is, why are they not more jealous of their own institutional imperatives?
Well, right. What you've identified is really a longstanding flaw in the Constitution. And neither of us is the first person to identify this, but the founders weren't thinking about political parties when they designed the system. Parliamentary forms of government are designed with parties in mind. You have party control as in the core of how those systems are supposed to operate. But what the American Constitution designed was they imagined that these separate branches would operate as branches independently of each other, right? So that they would be jealous of their powers and make sure the other branches didn't impinge upon their control. So you would have Congress making sure the president didn't take too much power because Congress would want to make sure the Congress is strong. And the president would do the same thing vis-a-vis Congress, and the executive branch and the legislature and the judicial branch would all check each other. But parties upend those incentive systems, right? When you've got Congress and the president controlled by the same party, members of Congress just want the president to succeed. Now, that's a long-standing feature of American politics, but it's kind of risen to a new height under the Republican Party because Donald Trump has so much power over other Republicans. The Republican Party has come to define its ideology almost entirely in whatever terms Donald Trump sets. And Trump has shown that he can just change what the party stands for overnight, and most Republicans will follow him instantaneously. He's also shown that any Republicans who defy him, he can say that they're a rhino or a Republican in name only, and support a primary challenge against them and probably end their political career.
So let's talk about the Democrats now, because you've also been writing about them.
Yeah.
You're not impressed.
No.
You're not impressed. Say more.
Well, I wrote a piece about the Democratic National Committee's recent meeting where they elevated their leader and sort of had a bit of a discussion about what's happened in the past and where they want to go. And you've got to be a little bit careful talking about a meeting like this because the Democratic National Committee sounds like it would be in charge of the Democrats, but it's really an organization that has relatively limited power. If you're a Democrat running for office, you don't have to go to the Democratic National Committee to find out what to say or who's going to be the candidate in your district. Well, that's determined by voters. But I think you can't just stop there because the reason, or at least one reason, the DNC is so powerless is that a lot of the power over the Democratic Party has been ceded to the progressive movement infrastructure over the past 15 to 20 years. Progressive activist groups financed privately by donors, often very liberal donors, have advanced a series of causes and, environmental justice and reproductive justice and racial justice. And all those activists have set out to push the party to the left since the second Obama term. And they've had tremendous amounts of success in pushing them to the left. But I think in a lot of ways, they've pushed the party to the left of where the public is and where they were winning during the Obama era, and have had some responsibility for the defeats of the last election. And what I noticed in the DNC meetings is there didn't seem to be any acknowledgement of this problem. They just seemed to be doubling down on the same buzzwords and the same analysis that got them into the problem in the first place.
So, but what about members of Congress? I mean, they have, again, some of them have been in office for a long time. They have their own standing in their communities. They have their own reputations. So, where is the leadership there? I mean, is the simple problem here that there is no figure who commands the respect of, or at least the followership of sufficient numbers of even members of Congress to kind of create I don't know any other word to use, although it's become kind of
opposition,
a buzzword, a resistance.
Yeah.
Is that the issue? Is it a failure of sort of the leadership personalities?
Well, look, I think we should be a little bit patient in assessing the situation. I think it's a very common problem for a party that's shut out of power to lack effective voice and effective leaders because they just don't have a power base from which to operate it. And usually when parties come back, it's not because of the ideas that they're developing in opposition or the charisma of the leaders they have in opposition. It's because the ruling party, the governing party, overreaches and creates a backlash, and then the opposition party finds ways to exploit that backlash. I think whatever leaders the Democratic Party develops are going to come out of the presidential primary that's going to begin in 3 years or so, and they're going to figure out whatever issues resonate most with the public, whatever failures of this administration they can run against and craft a message. But my concern is that while they position themselves to do that, they recognize that they can't also take on a bunch of positions that are too far to the left of where the public is, that'll make it impossible for them to take advantage of public discontent with Trump.
And Vijay, before we let you go, the courts. I mean, so far the courts have been have confronted Trump and his agenda at multiple points. I mean, they've already said one federal judge has said, look, this idea of eliminating, birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment is overreach. But there's another argument to suggest that that's his goal, is to get some of these issues in court, because he does believe he appointed 3 of the current Supreme Court justices. They have demonstrated that they have a maximalist view of executive power. Is there any effective check on the actions of this president?
Well, you're certainly right that that's one. They have basically 2 routes by which this can work. One is that they just get these cases to court and they win, and they change the precedent, and they get the court to say, actually, the executive branch can just unilaterally eliminate any spending program it doesn't like. Now, that seems to violate the plain text of the Constitution and the way it's been understood for over 200 years. But the Constitution is whatever the 5 most conservative justices say it is. So if that's what they say it is, that's what it is. Secondly, it's possible that they're going to lose, but they'll move so fast that they'll have an effect anyway. That once you drive out the staff, the expertise, the institutional knowledge in a lot of these agencies, because they can't sit around waiting forever to see if they win in court. They've got to go on their lives. They've got mortgages to pay. They've got things to do with their lives. You won't be able to rebuild it. So I think that the second danger is probably more serious than the first, but either one is a possibility.
Jonathan Chait, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Now, the British government is launching a formal investigation into the social media platform X after the site's AI chatbot, Grok, was being used to generate and spread non-consensual sexual images of women and children. Despite extensive backlash to the abusive imagery, Elon Musk and President Trump have claimed that any attempts to regulate the site would be an attack on free speech. Our next guest, the Atlantic staff writer Charles Warzel, tells Hari Srinivasan why Elon Musk cannot keep getting away with this.
Christian, thanks. Charlie Warzel, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece recently in The Atlantic, and you said Elon Musk cannot get away with this. If there is no red line around AI-generated sex abuse, then no line exists. And I wonder, what got you so upset about this? You've been somebody who's covered technology companies and trends for years. Why does this feel different?
Well, I think in some ways it's very self-explanatory, right? This chatbot Grok, which is hooked into Elon Musk's X, it's built by XAI, his AI company that is also integrated with formerly Twitter, now X. It started to generate these images of people in bikinis or people in cellophane bikinis, so it was see-through, etc. People then started putting, asking the chatbot to put pictures of seemingly children in there, and it started to become this tool that was hooked into this social network, and it was used to viralize and weaponize this type of harassment. We've seen this since the arrival of generative AI. We've seen that there is a problem with these undressing apps, right? With people taking photos of people and putting them in these compromising situations against their will. We've also seen problems with trolling and a lack of content moderation on platforms like X under Elon Musk, and even on Facebook and other places. We've seen message boards like 4chan that have these awful people on them who just want to cause chaos, who just want to hurt people, who just want to troll. What happened on X from I think it was around December 30th to, very recently, was the combination of all these things. It was like taking 4chan and hooking it up to a popular social network that, politicians, celebrities, brands, maybe I used to post on this network. And it was being used to intimidate and harass at scale. It basically turned child sex abuse material and just normal, not like revenge porn style sexual abuse into a meme. And that was something I think was unprecedented.
I want to read a statement that Grok, or X's safety team, they posted. It said, quote, "We have implemented technological measures to prevent the Grok account on X globally from allowing the editing of images of real people and revealing clothing such as bikinis. This restriction applies to all users, including paid subscribers. Additionally, we'll geo-block in jurisdictions where such content is illegal. The ability of all users in those locations to generate images of real people in bikinis, underwear, and similar attire in Grok on X." So are the measures that they're taking sufficient? Do you see any evidence that it's actually happening and restricting any of this type of material from existing?
I think that the measures are beginning to be sufficient, or more sufficient. It happened it happened basically over a series of steps, right? At first, X decided that it was going to disable the ability for image generation for people to basically prompt the chatbot, right? This was the weaponized, viralized thing. Grok put her in a bikini. It disabled that, which sort of added one small layer of friction.
Yeah.
Then the platform said, okay, we're going to make image generation a paid feature. That in itself was somewhat disturbing because then it essentially makes, non-consensual AI-generated revenge porn a paid feature on the platform. After, I'd say, 3 or 4 days of more and more pressure and outrage, finally they took these restrictions. There are now many fewer instances. I have not really been able to find instances of this being abused in the way that it was. But if you go to other forums, right? There are Reddit pages. There are other, I won't, describe where they are in other corners of the internet. You see people trying as a group to jailbreak Grok and these image generators, trying to get around all those guardrails and trying to figure out the best way to prompt, a chatbot to put someone in these types of compromising situations. So I think that the problem has been addressed for now, but it took basically 2 weeks of some of the most heinous stuff that I have seen on the internet as a product feature for this company to act.
And one of your concerns is that while this might have happened in the backwaters of the internet, this was right in the kind of the main bloodstream here, and this just weaponized the scale of how fast this information could spread. Am I right?
Yeah, it becomes a meme and it becomes a culture, right? There's always been a problem with, women and vulnerable people being harassed on X and across social media and all kinds of places. And some of that is just the chaos of tons of people being networked together. You're going to get bad actors, and it's a whack-a-mole problem, right? This was a different order of magnitude because it became a game that people were playing. And, Elon Musk has said for a very long time that he is this free speech maximalist. Now, he doesn't practice that in his actual running of X. But there was this feeling, as there is always when there are these trolls and harassers on the platform, that this is just, if you're going to make a free speech omelet, you're going to have to break some eggs, right? This is just what it looks like in practice. Mm-hmm. That is fundamentally not the case. That argument is actually wrong because as you saw with this, when people were trying to call out this behavior, when people were trying to flag politicians or other tech companies who could pressure Elon Musk or Elon Musk himself, there was an army of trolls who were using this feature to silence women, to basically bully them off the platform. So this is a prime example of the ways where if you don't have any guardrails or guidelines for content moderation, what you're actually doing is restricting speech. You are chilling other speech from happening because the trolls and the bullies have so much power.
Several countries have decided to push back on what happened over these couple of weeks. Indonesia, Malaysia, they've suspended the AI bot. Australia, Canada, France, Malaysia, UK have kind of investigated the creation of all of these sexualized deepfake images. California is looking at an investigation whether or not the Grok bot basically violated the state laws by facilitating the creation of non-consensual sexual images. And I wonder, are any of these things going to be enough of a consequence for Elon Musk or Grok to change the way that they roll out product features?
The bans are, interesting, right? People can obviously get around them with VPNs or things like that.
Yeah.
I think that when it comes to legislation in the government or people, like California looking into this, I think what is important in this sense is that people in power or who can put pressure on these companies care enough to look into it, to threaten that action, right? There needs to be some kind of feeling of consequences, because what's happened right now is, and I wrote this in the piece, this feeling of this culture of impunity, this crisis of impunity right now in the second Trump administration, where Donald Trump sort of sets the standard for how a lot of different institutions and politicians and executives and people with power can behave. And there is this feeling that there are no consequences. There's too much going on. There's too much chaos. The zone is so flooded that basically if you can just hang on and not apologize and just move forward, it will get buried by the next avalanche of bad news or outrage or what have you. And you can just kind of keep going and making money and doing the thing that you wanted to do. And I think the reason I wrote this piece, the reason I'm so mad about this, the reason why I do think that it's great that, some lawmakers are looking into this, is that this was such an egregious example of somebody running a company so recklessly and hurting all these vulnerable people, that I think this is a moment for us to kind of freeze on something like this and say, people need to suffer some kind of consequences for this. There are young children who were sexually harassed, whose image, was used against their will in a sexual manner. And we can't just look away from that. We can't just say, oh, it's a bug. This is something that we just have to deal with in the age of generative AI. And if we, as a society, do give up and just let them run roughshod, I think that we've crossed some kind of line, and I don't think we can claw it back. We can't. We basically then have said we've ceded these platforms to chaos.
A statement from Elon said, "I'm not aware of any naked underage images generated by Grok, literally zero. When asked to generate images, it will refuse to produce anything illegal, as the operating principle for Grok is to obey the laws of any given country or state. There may be times when adversarial hacking of Grok prompts does something unexpected. If that happens, we fix the bug immediately." Have they fixed all of these bugs?
Well, to be fair to X, they have fixed plenty to try to, respond to some of this outrage as it has really reached a fever pitch. But the idea that Musk is separating in his mind this idea of like what Grok is generating versus what it's generating when it's being adversarially hacked, you can't do that as the owner of a piece of technology, because there is no technology that reaches a certain level of prominence that isn't adversarially hacked. This is the table stakes of creating a technology that you deploy out to millions of people, is that you have to play this game of whack-a-mole. You have to have teams of people who are willing to protect the users from people who are going to try to break the technology.
At the same time that this is happening or was happening, the Pentagon announced that Grok would be integrated on, quote, every unclassified and classified network throughout the Pentagon systems. Should we be concerned on a structural level that a software, let's just look at it as a software company, rolls out something to the public that's so bad, and at the same time, it's going to have access to every military secret that we have?
I don't look at it and say Grok is bad, right? Grok is a bully, or Grok is a sexual deviant or something like that. It's all about the parameters. It's all about what the people who are programming these models, like the guardrails that they're instituting, the ways that they are being, prompted behind the scenes to respond, right? And Grok is being prompted to respond in a racier manner, in a sort of no holds barred, no censorship manner. And so my worry is with the people who are in charge of that company. They are making these decisions. Elon Musk, other people at XAI are making these decisions to have their large language model behave in a very specific way. And that is extremely concerning when you start thinking about the ways that, it could be integrated with the Pentagon.
There is legislation in the United States. Congress has this bipartisan Take It Down Act, right? And that was passed in May of last year. It kind of gives the platforms until May of this 2026, where they have to establish some sort of a notice and a takedown procedure. Do you think that this type of legislation will work? I mean, can it keep up with how fast technology is evolving?
Bluntly, I don't think it can. I think some of that too is the craven nature of some of our politicians, some of our lawmakers. Ted Cruz is a co-sponsor of that bill. He initially, when this Grok scandal was first, kicking off, said this is unacceptable, mentioned his own sponsorship of the bill, and then last week he posted a photo on Twitter of him with his arm around Elon Musk, saying it's always great to see this guy. I mean, I think that says everything right there, right? Not only is Congress and legislation up against, as you said, like this pace, this speed of how these things happen, right? As soon as people feel like they may have a handle on, the Web 2.0 version of social media, then you layer in generative AI on top of that, right? And you have, this idea that we were just talking about of like, what is the liability there? Did these companies generate this? Should they be held liable for what, for what their users do with the generative AI tools that they build? You have all of these concerns and the fact that the technology is racing ahead of, what the lawmakers, can imagine and what the law can do. But also you just have this crisis of impunity, as I said, right? If one of the co-sponsors of the bill feels totally valid posting on Elon Musk's social media platform, basically, touting his friendship with the guy who did not stop this thing from happening, this scandal, this crisis from happening. What are we doing here?
When you broaden this out, there was a UK-based nonprofit called the Internet Watch Foundation. And in 2024, they found 13 instances of AI-generated videos of child sex abuse. In 2025, they found 3,440. And that's before any of the stuff with Grok that we're talking about. If this trajectory continues, I just wonder in 26 or 27, what percentage of what's generated by AI goes from, oh, look, it's funny cat videos, to this stuff.
The truth is it's going to go up if we let it. That number is going to go up if, as a society, as a, culture in places like Silicon Valley, the people who make these tools, the politicians, the watchdogs, etc., the press, everyone, if we allow it to, if we let these instances slip by and people don't lose their jobs or these companies don't face significant repercussions, and I'm not talking about slap on the wrist fine, it's going to go up. And it's going to go up in a way that is incredibly concerning if you are a person with a conscience or a parent or, like truly anyone who has a sense of moral compass, because I've been in these communities to report on them at great like psychological turmoil to myself, and watched these anonymous people bring up innocent photos taken from Instagram and say, hey, can you put this person in this thing? A daughter, a son, a younger person, what have you. It's disgusting. It's despicable. And if we do not draw the reddest of red lines around this AI generated non-consensual sex abuse material of minors, but also just, people of age, if we do not culturally just say, this is poison, this is cancerous, this needs to be excised, this behavior needs to be treated the same way we treat that material when it's not AI generated and it's out in the world. If we don't do something about that, that number is going to go up. And real people are going to be devastated by that. And I just think that those are the stakes of this entire scandal.
Staff writer at The Atlantic, Charlie Warzel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.